Task Force TV, live from the 27th National Conference on LGBTQ Equality, Creating Change in Denver, Colorado.
Thank you for joining Politini's On the Run show live from the LGBT Task Force Conference here at Creating Change in Denver. This is the 27th annual Creating Change Conference, Danielle. It's amazing. My name is Aisha Moddle-Mills.
I'm Danielle Moddle-Mills.
And we are here with some exciting guests to talk to you about the theme for this year's conference.
So we know that we have borne witness to some of the most incredible activism probably any of us have seen in our lifetime, coming out of Ferguson, coming out of Ohio, New York, all over the country. Die-ins, Black Lives Matter social media takeover, and conversation that started in social media and then was forced into mainstream media because of the groundswell. And so we want to talk to the both of you, the fabulous leaders, okay, Rinku Sen and Rashad Robinson, about what your organizations were doing to keep the fire alive during Ferguson.
Yeah.
Okay, so at Race Forward and at Color Lines, we were on top of the story as soon as it appeared on our social media feeds. And we knew really immediately that it was going to be big. In the 6 days after Michael Brown was killed, those 6 days we did tons of coverage, just following everything that was happening in the recent developments. And we had over 2 million hits on our Facebook page, which
in
for
6 days.
An independent
I was following your feed.
Publication like us is a lot, and it's definitely a high point, a peak in our history. So we could tell that people all over the country were really, that particular shooting had hit a nerve, as it did in the local community there, and that people were going to be really needing to know what was happening. So that was one thing that we did. And then we have a conference that we do every other year called Facing Race, and it was a Facing Race year. We did it in November, and we had set the whole program and everything for the conference long before August, but then the Ferguson story broke. And so we managed, working with Color of Change and some other folks, the Center for Media Justice, we managed to raise a little bit of money to bring 7-8 Ferguson activists to the conference. They did a special breakfast briefing for the conference attendees, and this was our most well-attended conference ever, more than 1,600 participants, and we had a peak in conference registrations after August. So Ferguson clearly galvanized the entire racial justice community, and I think it reminded some people, or it taught some people, that racism actually does still exist in the United States and still needs to be actively fought. So I think anybody who might have been feeling a little bit like, this fall I'll take it easy, or I'll focus on my local politics and not national or something, just really needed to be in a national setting, multiracial, with other people who were devoted to racial justice and who really wanted to see police reform happen in particular.
And Rashad, Color of Change, you live in social media. You guys live online with over 1 million members. What were you guys doing during that time?
Like Race Forward and like Color Lines, we knew very early on that this was a particular moment. But we've continued to have to show up to these moments. The Eric Gardner moment, the Trayvon Martin moment, the Jordan Davis moment, the Renisha McBride moment, over and over again when Black people are harmed and hurt by vigilantes or by law enforcement, and nothing seems to be done, or justice seems sort of out of our reach. You know, our initial reaction was one of the things that we oftentimes do, it's capturing that moment and that energy where people are seeing this on social media but need something to do beyond posting articles, beyond sharing information. You know, where's the target lie? And the target for us, you know, at that point really was the Justice Department. But that what we were seeing locally was that there was going to be nothing done, that we had a local law enforcement that had no incentive, no political incentive to move anything forward. So what we did really was channel that energy at the Justice Department. Civil rights in this country has oftentimes been something that the Justice Department has to get in. Whether it was walking Black voters into voting polls, or walking Black students into desegregate schools, so much of our civil rights work has been about calling on our federal government during those needs. So what we were able to do, I was on the ground in Ferguson in the early days as the tanks rolled in. What we were trying to do was channel for our 1 million+ members and the Netroots community as a whole, working with an array of other Netroots organizations, having them take our outreaches, having them take what we were writing on the ground and basically take it and translate it for their members. So Move On, Ultraviolet, Credo, Moms Rising, reaching over 10 million Netroots community folks, delivering nearly 1 million petitions to the White House, and then having meetings outlining a list of demands while young people were on the ground, literally putting their lives on the line, channeling that energy into a set of national demands of things that the federal government can and need to do so that an organization like mine doesn't have to keep showing up over and over to these moments. We're not going to solve racism or police brutality with a set of federal demands. What we do need to do in these moments is think about what type of police accountability do we put in place? How do we leverage these moments, this moment where people are outraged and angry, and translate into the type of demands that allow us to start moving on the road to real movement building? So people need to see that there's going to be victories. And we've seen some real stuff. We've been in deep meetings with the White House. I testified last week in front of the President's Commission on Police Reform. We worked with the young people on the ground. We actually paid to bring the movie Selma, months before it came out, to the activists in the ground, and brought Common as well to have a talk back with a lot of the activists about some of the stuff that was in the movie, but talking about the history of sort of movement building and what they were doing. Connecting what was happening in Ohio, connecting what was happening in Staten Island, and translating all these moments into hopefully what will be a moment that we can look back on 5 years from now and 10 years from now and say, this is when we got this type of change.
Right.
This is when we got this piece of legislation.
Let's talk a little bit about the movement building piece of this and the intersectionality of that. One of the things that's really exciting to me is that you two are the keynotes for tonight's opening plenary here at the LGBT Task Force, conference. And so it's very awesome and interesting to have a really deep, thoughtful conversation about the racial dynamics in this country and that intersection around equality, social justice, civil rights generally. So talk to us a little bit about why it's powerful that we're here talking about Ferguson, we're talking about racial justice, we're talking about the overlap there with LGBT issues also.
Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to give a lot of credit and praise to Ray, Carrie, and her team at the LGBTQ Task Force for making this decision, right? To center this conversation front and center, to also center reproductive rights as one of the other conversations, and in previous years to center the stories of transgender people, on center stage, not having them off to the side. This is what in many ways makes an organization like the LGBTQ Task Force different than many of the other mainline organizations. When I left GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation a number of years ago, to take over at Color of Change, I would have this joke when I would show up places and have to, tell people that I was the head of Color of Change and not, coming to do GLAAD work, and I would say, I'm black now, I'm not gay. And so I would say, I'm black now, not gay. And what I've been so inspired, being on the ground in Ferguson, being able to work with in the presence of some of these young activists, is how they bring their whole selves into the room. The way in which their intersectionality is front and center. It's not a strategy, it's not a tactic, it's who they are. It's been inspiring for me as a board member of the LGBTQ Task Force. It makes me recognize my responsibility to help continue to push this movement to be more open. As a leader of a black civil rights organization, it reminds me of my responsibility to lead, not just on issues, but to lead in a visible and present way around who I am. And I think these conversations are just critically important for us to move the needle in a holistic way and recognize that as our country becomes more diverse, we have to think about our activism really being centered in that diversity.
I love what you're talking about a holistic way of operating. And I wanted to know, Rinku, if you would speak to the criticism that has come towards activist groups, activists, the advocates in Ferguson and all around the country for not being organized, right? For not having a leader. And you, as two leaders of organizations that are leading the charge in many ways on social media and on the ground, what do you say to that criticism that we need to be following more so in line with the tactics of Selma, as opposed to looking at this in a holistic 21st century movement?
These are the tactics of Selma, and I think what we've got here is is truly a movement. And the way that you know that it is actually a movement is that you have really decentralized leadership and a lot of spontaneous activity that doesn't seem to be generated from a single central spot or a single central leader or organization. And out of that activism, much of which is like really startup, it's people's first entry into social change organizing, into protest, into trying to make institutional change. And I think it's really unfair to say, you 18-year-old who got started 2 weeks ago, you should have a really sophisticated strategy. I have every faith in the world that that strategy is going to develop locally, and there are people moving police reform and police accountability strategy all over the country really successfully, and those two sets of people are connected, and so there can only be good legislation and good policy change and good movement building coming out of that. Rashad and I both live in New York City, where Communities United for Police Reform have brought an end to the practice of stop and frisk in New York City,
Yes.
have been fighting on police brutality issues, and all obstacles notwithstanding, including a big thing that happened in New York City when 2 police officers were killed in December. That moment was really hard for the movement, I think, and polarizing for people, for the community, and for New York residents in general. But that organization has been winning. It's going to continue to win. It has models. There are, in fact, solutions and models of good policing. They are not well known. They are not widely practiced, but they do exist. And people in Ferguson are going to find them and move them into the debate there.
Speaking of the people in Ferguson, what's interesting is that some of the leaders of this movement are actually Black queer people, which is the Black Lives Matter movement, which is really fascinating. So we're going to see some awards happen tonight with the young queer women who started Black Lives Matter, the hashtag. What's also interesting, though, is that despite that, most of the outrage and the energy of the movement has been focused on these atrocities against Black men and boys. We just had 3 transgender women who were killed. In the last year, I think there have been about 12 killings of Black transgender women, and we're not seeing the same kind of outrage. And this might be a precursor to what you guys are going to talk about tonight. But can you talk to us a little bit about how we can include in the movement, I think in a broader way, some of the things that are happening in terms of victimization and the police brutality and stop and frisking that's happening to LGBT people as well?
What I was going to say earlier to your question about intersectionality is that many people who work in racial justice are queer. Many people who work in LGBTQ equality issues and liberation are of color. But focusing on the racial justice piece, what is so beautiful about inviting us to speak tonight and about this conference focusing on racial justice issues is that these conferences are gathering places for people who have an identity, whose politics are in different places of development, who have different kinds of politics, and introducing the LGBTQ community of the country to racial justice leaders, to racial justice organizations, and to racial justice fights, I think is such an important political education function that conferences like this, that's what we're meant to do. So that's really important, and I think that as queer leaders in racial justice, and as I'm sure leaders of color in the sexual liberation movement, very often it's just really nice to see the issues that are important to you as a person recognized by your organization and by your movement.
Right.
That does something for our morale, for our sense that people are with us. It fights isolation and unifies us, and that's what gatherings like this are supposed to do. And I think that if we are able to keep doing that, then we're going to keep getting the kind of practice we need in applying a lens to whatever issue we're working on that might not be our first lens. My first lens on anything I look at, any situation, is race and gender. Those are the dynamics I can pick out. And I have to work a little harder, it's true, to adopt a sexuality lens, a little harder to have a good economic lens. But I do get there, and it doesn't take too much longer. If we want to solve the problems we're solving for everybody, then we have to be able to look at those problems through different lenses. And I think conferences like this teach people how to do that in addition to actually being on the ground campaigning.
Well, last word you get,
yes.
Rashad.
What's next?
Well, I think what's next is that, this movement is continuing. We are continuing to see young people putting their lives on the line and standing up for what's right. And you're seeing organizations, bringing those demands, people bringing those demands front and center. I think that, over these next several years, we're going to see a series of police reforms that get in place. And it is just the first step on the long road of making our communities safe, making our communities responsible, making our communities open for all of us.
Well, thank you to the both of you. We're excited to see your speeches tonight.
Yes,
Looking forward to that.
Please continue bringing the fire the way that you guys have, because it's exciting to watch and participate in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Task Force TV, live from the 27th National Conference on LGBTQ Equality, Creating Change in Denver, Colorado.